Welcome to Oasis Church Online. I'm Pastor Augie, and today we're going to be kicking off a new series called Greatest Hits. We're calling the series Greatest Hits. And in this series, what we plan to do is use music titles as titles of our messages. And in this series, this is a topical series. We're going to look at together the stories from the Bible that maybe are very familiar to you, and maybe some that are not so familiar to you. And what we'll do is we'll use modern, song titles from the 70s, 80s, whatever, song titles in order to bring all of those things together. Speaking of song titles, this past week I was in the White Mountains up with my family, and I went to a thrift store and I found this cassette tape. We were just burning some time trying to wait for one of our family members to show up. And I found this Dan Fogelberg cassette tape, and it was the greatest hits. And it was so funny because I remember my mom having this cassette tape, and we would listen to it in her Volkswagen Bug. And as I was there at the thrift store, I was thinking, man, what was so good about Dan Fogelberg? I hadn't heard his music for a while. And so I downloaded some of it onto my iPhone, which is interesting because you can still buy a cassette and also download the music. And it says greatest hits there. And I can remember some of these songs. I didn't know any by the titles, but as I listened to them, I began to remember some of those songs from when I was a kid cruising around in my mom's Volkswagen Bug. I wonder why people liked Dan, and I began just kind of thinking through it. And I mean, he's a good-looking dude, for sure. He's got some great love songs and things like that. Maybe you're a fan of Dan Fogelberg, or maybe you're not. He was very popular in the 70s and 80s. At least that's when this little greatest hits album came out. But here's what I want to do this morning. I want to find out from you and ask you a question and ask you, in what decade do you believe, from your own perspective, from your own taste, in what decade was the best music produced? Was it produced in the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even the 2010s? Here's how I want you to interact. Right now, as you're watching online, go ahead and type a comment down below and tell us from your opinion, when was the best music produced? What era? The 70s or the 80s? And maybe if you grew up a long time ago, the 50s or the 40s, I don't know. But go ahead and make those comments right now. I just kind of get some interaction between the people online. And I know that everyone has a different kind of choice, a different opinion about the music that they like and what they're interested in and what was their favorite. And so what I plan to do over the next 3 messages is I'm going to look at some messages, some song titles from the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And I really tried to spread some stuff out and hopefully choose some song titles that all of you will remember. And so I'm excited about this series. I hope that you stick with us for the next 6 or 7 weeks. And I'm also excited about what we get to do in person. Of course, this series we're doing is online and in person. Online, we're not going to be able to do all of the things that we would in person because of copyright laws. So we can't play the songs for you necessarily. And so I want to invite you to come in person and be able to participate in some of those things. We're going to do some Name That tunes and stuff like that. So I'm excited about this series and hope that you stick with us for the next few weeks. The title of today's message is In the Air Tonight, and that's a song by Phil Collins from 1981 from the album Face Value. I can't play it for you, but if you were to think back to the 80s, this was a song from 1981 and has a very famous drum solo. It goes something like this. It goes do 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 do, and this very, very famous. In fact, this song, and one of the reasons why I'm choosing this song for today's message title is because on TikTok, which, is a brand new thing, or at least, recent thing, they're using that song as a video. And so I'm hoping that some of you younger viewers can remember that song, or you're familiar with that song. And then, of course, the people older like me that were listening to music in the 80s, you'll remember that song as well. I actually bought this album. This was my first record that I bought. I don't have it anymore. Because of an interesting story. But anyway, in 1981, I was 6 years old. I didn't buy it when I was 6, but I do remember saving up money and buying that album Face Value. It was the big record, and I had a record player, and I loved it. It was the first record that I bought. And then in junior high, I bought it when I was in junior high, and then I went to youth camp. I remember we went up to youth camp at Pine Valley. And I can remember as a junior higher, one of the leaders there was talking about how secular music was of the devil. And I came back from youth camp and I smashed that record into 1,000 pieces. And my brother continues to laugh at me about it. And I regret it. I absolutely regret it. I still wish I had that record. But I remember that song, absolutely remember that song, In the Air Tonight. That's our message title for today. And I hope that you can understand that I'm not preaching about Phil Collins, okay? In these messages that we do in this series, we're not preaching about the song itself. We're not going to cover the song. We're not promoting Phil Collins or anything like that. But what I want, we're preaching the Bible. And what I want to do is use that song title, In the Air Tonight, to talk about something that's very real and very current in our life today. And as you think about the situation that we find ourselves in right now. We're recording this in August of 2020. If you're watching years later, you'll know, looking back, that there's just chaos surrounding us. There's something in the air tonight. Think about all of the stuff that has happened. We're dealing with a worldwide pandemic. We're dealing with an election year when all of this chaos is just going all over the place. There are riots and protests, and you can't even really have a conversation with anyone anymore if they have a different opinion than you, because it seemed as, a battle, or you hate this person or you hate this person. There's just like all reason has flown out the window, and there's just something in the air tonight that is there's just like a darkness and a gloom. But I pray that as we look at the text today, that it will encourage you. I pray that it'll give you hope for the future, and that we'll be able to open our eyes to see that God is moving, that He's absolutely still in control. And yes, there is something in the air tonight, and it's God doing a good work in you and me. And I pray that we're able to look at the story of Elisha this morning and be able to look at it and say, yes, God is doing something new. So let's turn to the book of 2 Kings chapter 6 this morning. We're going to be looking at a story, and one of the main characters is Elisha, and hopefully you've heard of Elisha. We'll be looking at verse 8 through 13, actually 8 through 23, but what I want to do this morning as you're turning to 2 Kings chapter 6, what I want to do is just kind of give you a review or a synopsis of what's happened in the story so far, because there's a lot of text for me to read. The king of Aram has got beef with the king of Israel, and the Arameans are fighting. They're constantly battling the Israelites, and they're coming after them. They're trying to kill them. And well, what's happening is God is allowing Elisha to hear the king of Aram's plans. He's giving him like what the king is thinking. He's giving him this insider information, and the king of Aram would be, he'd be talking to his men and saying, okay, we're going to go and sabotage the Israelites here. We're going to lay in for them. We're going to go after them. And when he's having those conversations, Elisha is hearing them. God's allowing him to hear something happening hundreds of miles away. And so then Elisha goes and tells the king of Israel, and he says, hey, the king's coming, the enemy's coming. And the king eventually gets upset. He doesn't realize this. He thinks that there's a traitor in his midst. And so he's talking to his advisor. He's saying, one of you is a traitor. One of you is telling Israel when we're coming, you're giving them our information. And they're like, no, we heard that it's Elisha, that God speaks to him. He tells him our plans. And the king of Aram says, you know what? Well, we got to take him out. We got to find him, and we got to kill him. And so he sends spies to go find Elisha. They find him. And then this is where we pick the story up here in verse 14. Let me read it for you. It says, so one night the king of Aram sent a great army with many chariots and horses to surround the city. Now the city was Dothan. That's where Elisha was. That's where he was staying at that point. So the king of Aram, he sends his men, he sends the army to go get Elisha at Dothan. Verse 15, when the servant of the man of God, so when Elisha's servant, when the servant of the man got up early the next morning and went outside, there were troops, horses, and chariots everywhere. Oh, sir, what will we do now? The young man cried to Elisha. So Elisha's servant gets up in the morning. He finds this huge enemy army surrounding them, and he's freaked out. He's scared, which of course, most of us would be. Look at how Elisha responds. Verse 16, Elisha says, "Don't be afraid," Elisha told him, "for there are more on our side than on theirs." Then Elisha prayed, "O Lord, open his eyes and let him see." The Lord opened the young man's eyes, and when he looked up, he saw the hillside around Elisha was filled with horses and chariots of fire. You see, Elisha's servant goes out. He sees the enemy. The Arameans are there. There's all of these people surrounding him. He's like, "Oh no, what are we going to do?" And Elisha says, "God opened my servant's eyes to see the reality of the situation." And God opens his servant's eyes, and he sees that there are chariots of fire and horses and angels surrounding them, that God was there with them. Let's continue verse 18. The Aramean army advanced toward him, and Elisha prayed, "O Lord, please make them blind." So the Lord struck them with blindness as Elisha had asked. So they're coming at him. The enemy is coming at Elisha, and Elisha asks God, "Please blind them." Blind them is what he says. And God answers that prayer. Verse 19, then Elisha went out and told them, "You've come the wrong way. This isn't the right city. Follow me, and I will take you to the man you are looking for." And he led them to the city of Samaria. This reminds me of one of the Star Wars movies. I don't remember which one. I think it was like Return of the Jedi, I believe. This has happened years ago. And there are these stormtroopers looking for the droids, C-3PO and R2-D2, I think. And Luke is there, and Obi-Wan's there, and they're in this cruiser. And the stormtroopers stop them, and they're like, "Hey, those are the droids we're looking for." And Obi-Wan he says, "These aren't the droids you're looking for." And the stormtrooper says, "These aren't the droids I'm looking for." And Obi-Wan says, "Let us go." And he goes, "Yeah, let them go." This is what this reminds me of. It's like this Jedi mind trick that Elisha pulls as God's power flows through him. He doesn't physically blind them, but he blinds them to the reality of the situation. Let's continue. Verse 20. As soon as they had entered Samaria, Elisha prayed, "O Lord, now open their eyes and let them see." So the Lord opened their eyes, and they discovered that they were in the middle of Samaria. So God uses Elisha here. He takes his enemy to their enemy territory. They're surrounded on all sides. And Elisha's right in the middle of all this. Let's continue, verse 21. When the king of Israel saw them, he shouted to Elisha, "My father, should I kill them? Should I kill them?" I read that and I'm like, man, I hope my son never asked me, "Should I kill them? Should I kill them?" It's just a crazy response. I mean, I guess the king of Israel sees his enemy. They're surrounding them. They have them where they want them. And so he wants to take advantage of the situation. And here's Elisha's response, verse 22. "Of course not," Elisha replied. "Do we kill prisoners of war? Give them food and drink and send them home again to their master." So the king made a great feast for them and then sent them home to their master. And after that, the Aramean raiders stayed away from the land of Israel. I love this story. It's such a great story. And I'm hoping that maybe you've already heard the story. To me, this is one of the greatest hits of the scriptures where God shows up in a mighty way. And I want for us this morning to look at some of the realities of that situation and how they apply to us as well. Now, like I said, I love this story just from a historical perspective and also from a very current perspective as well. Because Elisha finds himself surrounded by an enemy, surrounded by darkness and doom and gloom. And God was there. God was right in the middle of it. And we find ourselves today, like I talked about a few minutes ago, we find ourselves today in a similar situation. There is all kinds of darkness. There's something in the air tonight, right? There's something in the air. There's just a darkness and a gloom. And there are some things that are surrounding us in our life right now that if we look at Elisha's situation, we look at this Bible account, that we can see God show up, a few realities of God showing up in some very specific ways, and we can apply those same things to our life as well. So let's this morning look at three realities of Elisha's situation and how they apply to us. The first reality that I want for us to look at today is God's presence. God's presence. You see, God was right there with Elisha. He was right there the whole time. Even though Elisha's servant couldn't see God, couldn't see the angels, couldn't see the chariots of fire. It didn't mean that they weren't there. Elisha had to pray God open his eyes. Even though the enemy couldn't see God's presence, he was still right there. Let's look at verse 16 and 17 again. It says, "Do not be afraid," Elisha told him, "for there are more on our side than on theirs." Then Elisha prayed, "O Lord, open his eyes and let him see." Then the Lord opened the young man's eyes, and when he looked up, he saw that the hillside around Elisha was filled with horses and chariots of fire. Listen, through all of the chaos that surrounds you, God is there. He's got your back. And he doesn't just have your back, but he's got your front and your sides too. And one of the reasons he's always there is because and this is a big word, because he is omnipresent. That means that he is always everywhere present. He's in all places at the same time. Now that's a trippy thought to think about, but look at this text here in Psalm 139, 7 through 10. "I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. If I ride on the wings of the morning, if I dwell by the furthest oceans, even there your hand will guide me and your strength will support me." You see, God's there with you right now as you're watching online. God is with our good friend Crystal Eccles, who's on mission across the globe, across the ocean. He's there with her. He's with your friends that live in Vegas or Idaho or South Korea all at the same time because God is omnipresent. Now, this is a trippy thing to think about, and but just because it's a trippy thing to think about doesn't make it not true. And so God was there with Elisha. God was there the whole time. So we were talking about God's omnipresence in youth group a little while ago. And we were talking about how it's trippy for them and all of us really to think about how God can be here with me, but also with my buddy over in South Korea and those people that are planning churches in Brazil or whatever. And I think the problem for us most times is we think of God being in a specific place, like from a human standpoint. But I'm sure you can remember that song, "He's got the whole world in his hands," right? So, and you probably know that song, and you may think about this ball. And I got a blue ball to kind of represent the earth. Now, we talked about this with the youth a little while ago, that listen, if I'm God and I've got the whole world in my hands, it's not a difficult thing for me to think about, for me to be with you here, right, as you're in Arizona, but then also your buddy in Las Vegas, and then also your buddy down in Australia, and I'm also over here with those over in Southeast Asia. If God's got the whole world in his hands, he can be there. He's in all of these places at the same time. We tend to think of God from like a human perspective, a very small perspective, but really God is bigger than all of that. And so it's very easy for God to be in all of these places at the same time because he's bigger than we can even imagine, that he holds the world and the universe in his hands. And so he can easily be present in all of these situations at the same time. When you're struggling and you feel like the world is caving in, God's there. Open your eyes to see God in the situation. Maybe you have to pray just like Elisha prayed. God, open my eyes. Let me see you in this situation, because we're going to find ourselves in pretty crazy situations. And some of us are finding, that we just continue to be blasted into these chaotic situations as this year progresses. When we're troubled, when we're struggling to experience God, to see him, maybe, just maybe, we need to pray, God, open my eyes to see you here, because he's there and he wants us to acknowledge him. He wants us to see him. He wants us to rely on him in those situations. And so our prayer needs to be just like Elisha's. God, open my eyes to see you here. The second reality that we'll talk about this morning is God's protection. God's protection. Let's look at verse 18 again. As the Aramean army advanced toward him, Elisha prayed, "O Lord, please make them blind." So the Lord struck them with blindness as Elisha had asked. You see, God had protected Elisha and his servant from certain death. I mean, death was knocking on their door, and God protected them. Elisha prays, God blind them. And God does, right? And we talked about that whole Jedi mind trick that he pulled on them, that God used the situation to protect Elisha and a servant. Now, they were obviously not physically blind, but were blind to the reality of the situation. They were blind to the reality that God was protecting them. They were blind to the reality that God was present with them right then. And so Elisha takes them. He approaches the enemy, which is crazy. He goes out and he speaks to them, and he leads them to a different location. This reminds me of a message we talked about a few weeks ago about facing your fears, about conquering fear. And that first thing we have to do to conquer fear is we have to face it. You see, Elisha had to face the enemy, and he could face the enemy because he knew that God was there, that God was present, and that God was protecting them. So when you have God's protection, you can have the confidence to move forward into those trials that are coming your way. Psalm 34 verse 7 says this. It says, "The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them." This is, especially in difficult times like we find ourselves today. This is an incredibly encouraging verse, that God surrounds us with his angels when we're in trouble, and that we just have to open our eyes to see God surrounding us and protecting us. And God is mightier. He's more powerful. And we talked about this a few weeks ago as well. God's more powerful than anything we've ever known. And in fact, that draws us to another omni word. That omni word is omnipotent, that God is omnipotent. This means that he is all powerful. You see, God is more powerful than any force or being or anything in the known universe and the unknown universe. Because we worship and serve an omnipotent God, we can have the courage to fight those battles. We can have the courage, like Elisha, to go and approach the enemy and allow God to be with us and to protect us in those crazy times. You see, you can handle the situations that you find yourself in when you know reality number one, that God is there, and reality number two, that God is protecting you. Our third and final reality that we'll talk about this morning is God's providence. God's providence. Look at verse 23 with me again. "So the king made a great feast for them, and then sent them home to their master." And here's where we'll really look at it. "And after that, the Aramean raiders stayed away from the land of Israel." You see, God's presence and protection provided, right? Provided a solution to the growing hostility between the Arameans and the Israelites. Let me say that again. God's presence and protection provided a solution for Israel. And as you look at that, it says the raiders stayed away from the land of Israel. See, God provided a solution because he's a provider. See, God knew the situation. There was no more beef anymore. There were no more lives being lost because God knew what needed to happen. God knew the situation. And that draws us to another word. We said that he is omnipresent, that he is omnipotent, but he's also, this last word that relates to this reality, he's omniscient, meaning that he is all-knowing. Turn back to Psalm 139 with me, verse 1 through 4. It says this, it says, "O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord." God knows every piece of knowable information there ever is was, or will be. Think about that phrase. That's trippy. It's trippy that God is omniscient, that he knows everything that there ever was, is, or will be. There's literally nothing that he doesn't know. And that's awesome. It's trippy, but it's awesome as well. And so when life starts to throw a curveball at Elisha, right? Life starts to throw a curveball at him. God knows. And God has a plan. Even though Elisha didn't know the plan, God had a plan and provided a solution because he knew. You see, God already knew what was going to happen. God already knew what was going to take place. God already knew his plan because he's omniscient. Listen, when you find yourself, like Elisha, surrounded by an enemy, God knows. God is there. He's powerful enough to protect you, and he knows the plans that he has for you. You can trust that God has a solution, that we worship and serve a God that's a provider. And he will either provide a way out for you, or he will provide the courage to push through that trial. So don't forget that God is a provider. As I close, let's review those three realities this morning. In Elijah's situation, there are three realities. First of all, God's presence, that God was there in the situation. Reality number two, God's protection, that God protected them in that situation. Then reality number three, God's providence, that these three things together provided Elisha a way out of a really sketchy situation. So when you find yourselves, and many of us find ourselves right now, this is why I wanted to preach this message today, because I think it's applicable to us today, that many of us find ourselves in a similar situation. There's something in the air tonight, isn't there? There's just chaos surrounding us. And when we open our eyes to these three realities, that God is with us, that he's protecting us, and that he's providing for us, it can give us the courage to push through these situations and see God's providence and his protection and his presence help us be the best versions of ourselves in these crazy times. I pray that God will open your eyes to the reality that you find yourself in. Let's pray this morning. Thank you, God, so much for these three realities. Thank you for this account, these things that actually happen and how they can inform us and encourage us in these crazy times. There is definitely something in the air tonight, right now, going all over this nation and this world. God, keep us faithful to you. Allow us to see you in all of the chaos, to follow you and trust you in all of the chaos, and to know that you've got a plan, that you've got our back, and that you will always be here for us. Thank you so much, Father, for your Son, Jesus, for it's in his name we pray. Amen. I pray that you continue to join us on this series. We're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to look at a bunch of different song titles, and whether you liked the 70s or the 80s or even the 90s, or maybe even if you're young, the 2000s, we hope that you enjoy this time together as we kind of work through some stuff, some greatest hits of the scriptures, and then also some great song titles. We love you guys, and we'll see you next week.